We're going to pick back up in our series called Work Mission. If you've been with us over the last couple of weeks, you know that a few weeks ago we started part 3 called Who Are You Working For? Or affectionately, Who's the Boss? And I had to break it into 2 messages, and that break happened in the midst of last week, which wasn't that a fun time having breakfast during the worship service? Shout out to Alliance Youth and for them organizing that. Great job serving. Grateful for my friend Justin who was here and shared from the Word. He did a fantastic job. I always love listening to other people preach. It's way better than listening to myself preach, in my opinion. He did a great job. That was a fresh word. As a guy who works in a district office and could just have pulled out something from his Rolodex of sermons and shared with us, he wrote something fresh as the Lord was leading him. And I know I've talked to several of you about how impactful that was in your lives and what God is doing in your lives. And so I'm really grateful for that. Over the next couple of weeks, you're stuck with me. We are going to finish up the Work Mission series this week and next week. And then our Advent series I'm really excited about. It's called The Dragon and the Child, Christmas from the Book of Revelation. No, not kidding. It's going to be fantastic. We hope you join us. We're going to talk about the spiritual realities of what it means for Jesus to come and save us. So we are going to continue in the Work Mission series this week and next week. If you've been with us, we've been talking about this cultural phenomenon that's happening in the United States, at least in America, and that's this thing called the Great Resignation, that in droves, more numbers than previously recorded, people are leaving their jobs, transitioning from jobs, going from one company to another, going from a field of work to another field of work, or taking this time to reevaluate and saying, is this really this thing I've been doing for the last 5, 10, 15, 25 years? This thing I've been doing, is this really the thing that I want to continue doing? And so in light of this, we've talked about how important it is to have God's perspective on work and our work. And we wanted to leverage this cultural phenomenon to remind us of this reality, and that's that your family is your most important mission field. But your job is most likely, for most of us, our largest mission field. That your family always comes first, always takes priority. You want to live with integrity, and you want to be who you are among your family as you are here in church and among other believers. You want to live an integrated life with them. You want to demonstrate the goodness of God in your life to your family as priority, but you have possibly the opportunity for the largest impact through your job, that your job is your largest mission field. And again, going back to what it means to live an integrated life, we've talked about this false belief that many people have, and that's that we're supposed to live this divided life, and there's certain aspects of our life that God is really pleased by, and certain aspects of our life that God is not pleased by. And so there's sacred things like church and Bible studies and prayer and missions and giving and all of those things. And then there's another part of our lives that's secular. God's really not so concerned about it. We don't really know what to do with these things. Things like our education and our work, government, arts, recreation, the sciences. What is that? What do I do with those things? Some of those things feel even in conflict to my faith in God at times, and we wrestle with those things, right? And yet God desires for us to live a whole life, an integrated life, and all of those things, whether it's church or education, worship or work, government or prayer, all of those things can either be sacred or secular, depending on whom we devote those things to, depending on who we give ourselves to in the midst of those things. And that's why this question about who's the boss is so important. And so we've looked in the book of Genesis about how work in general is a good thing, that we're created in the image of a God who's creative and who works and who brought things into existence from nothing. And so it's good for us to participate in that as his image bearers. But because of sin and selfishness, not only is work good, but work is also hard. There's something broken about work. And in fact, we put so much of our identity on what we do as opposed to who we are in Christ. We struggle and have frustrations, and so we experience this every day. Whatever the beginning of your day, your work week is, maybe it's tomorrow, Monday, you go in and you're like, I'm super excited and super not excited at the same time, right? I'm really looking forward to finishing this project, but not working with this team. I'm really excited about this proposal, but I don't want to see my boss at all. Whatever the case may be, we experience this, that work is good, we love it, we find satisfaction in it, we are productive in it, and also that it's hard, it's broken, there's something out of whack. And the way that we bring that brokenness back into alignment with God's plan is through the consecration of our work to the Lord. And so Colossians 3:23 and 24 has been our theme verse throughout. Hopefully you've been memorizing it. If not, there's still a couple weeks left in order to memorize it. It's really easy. It says, whatever you do, work at it with all your hearts. Now I forget. As working for the Lord, not for human masters. You should memorize it as good as I memorize it. As working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ whom you serve. And so we have to put those that are vying to be in control of our work, job, vocation, whatever you find yourself giving time and energy to, we have to find God as the one who is calling the shots. So 2 weeks ago, we talked about the other bosses potentially that we can have in our lives. We talked about when ourself is the boss and the one calling the shots at our work. And we looked at the example of Esau, right? Who gave in to his appetite. Like, I'll trade everything. I'll trade my future. I'll trade God's intention for me for a cup of stew. The urgency of that current appetite was so strong that he was willing to sacrifice so much in order to have that one selfish urge met. And that often happens in the workplace. We see it all over the place, that somebody has this one urgent need and they sacrifice their integrity and their reputation and all of those things, and the future of what could have been crumbles as a result of giving in to that appetite. And then we also talked about when we let others call the shots in our lives and in our work. That we looked at the example of Martha, who had this root of resentment. Not that what she was doing was bad, but that she looked towards others as fulfilling this thing that only God could fulfill in her. And because of that, she had resentment and this secret pride that asked, why won't people help me? Why won't people see me? And so all of these things are important. Yourself is important when it comes to your work. Other people and their perspective, your boss and the team that you serve on, if you serve on a team, is important. But if we put them in the wrong order, and we don't put God as the one who is primarily the one who we are working from, and we let him influence how we respond to others, how we cooperate with others, and how some of the things that are internal to us are fulfilled, then we continue to walk in the brokenness of the world. We don't see the restoration of his original intention. And so today, we're going to look at a guy named Daniel in chapter 6. And as you're turning there, one of the things that I've loved about this series is that we've done some interviews with folks from our church family about what they like and don't like about their jobs. And so as I mentioned earlier, Jamie Zacharias, who's on our Sunshine, daycare team is up to bat. So listen to her story.
My name is Jamie. I have been working at Sunshine Nursery School for about 15 years now, and one thing that I love about my job is being able to have an impact on the children's lives. I've had several children come back from graduating high school or transitioning into high school and just coming back to say hi because they remember me. I've also had the privilege of seeing some of my students volunteer here at Sunshine, and it's amazing to see how much of an impact that we as teachers have on these children. However, there are a few things that frustrate me about my job. The first thing that frustrates me is when children are sick. My heart just goes out to them because there is nothing that we can do for them. And just seeing the children miserable, it's very hard. Another thing that frustrates me is when our families are stressed or having a hard time in their life. When that happens, then the children are stressed. And we've had a few families where our hearts just really went out to them because they were either in car accidents or had financial issues or just home life going on. And that really impacts the children. And it's really hard to see that happening in their lives because we really get close to our families. Another thing that really frustrates me is party days. We try so hard as teachers to make party days and holidays very special for the kids. We go all out, plan our lessons, and make sure it's great. Except we always forget that we get to keep those kids all day. So yeah, a bunch of kids on a bunch of sugar, not so much fun. However, I love that I get to work at a Christian center and be able to share the love of Jesus with the children. I love that I get to teach them prayers and pray for their families and pray for their needs. I love that I can teach them what the difference between a miracle and magic. I will say working with preschoolers and working with sharks, which are the older kids, is a little bit different when it comes to the Bible though. The sharks take in so much information, and being able to share their daily lives in Bible stories and answer the questions that they have that are impacting their lives is just amazing. And I got to experience that for the first time a couple years ago, and they really stumped me. They had some really good questions, and being able to answer those questions, it melted my heart. It made me feel really good that they were so eager to learn about Jesus and that I could be a part of that. So with that being said, being in a Christian center, I want my coworkers and the people around me to know that I love Jesus, and I want everything that I do reflect that I love Jesus. I really try to help my coworkers with their daily tasks and anything that's going on that they need help with. I really try to show the love of Jesus to everyone that's around me. Yeah, that's my life in the workplace, and I love that I get to show the love of Jesus to those around me.
Thanks, Jamie, for sharing your story. I've really appreciated those. Let me pray, and we'll read from Daniel chapter 6. Lord, thanks so much for this opportunity to open your word and to trust that your Holy Spirit is going to teach us from it. Lord, I pray that you would guide us in this time, and as we evaluate ourselves and look into our hearts and ask, when it comes to my work, if I try to push that aside and just make it something that I do on my own, or if I brought it under your direction, your leadership, your lordship, that you would be the boss even of what our lives look like in the workplace, or where we're giving our energy during the week, Lord. So we trust in you. Pray that you'd help us to learn from you. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so Daniel is a really interesting book and story. Let me kind of set up what's happened here. Daniel was part of a group of people who were captured by the Babylonians. And so he was living in the nation of Israel, and Israel had strayed from worshiping and following and obeying the commands of God. And so God allowed this foreign nation, Babylon, to come in and sack them, basically, to overtake them, to conquer them. And part of that, which was pretty typical in that time, was that you would take as many healthy individuals back into the conquering kingdom as slaves and workers as possible. And Daniel was one of those. Also mentioned in the book of Daniel are Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. You might have heard those guys about being thrown into the furnace, and you may have heard a little bit about Daniel as well. In Daniel chapter 1, it talks a little bit about that, Amelia, if you can go to Daniel chapter 1. It says in verses 3 through 5 a little bit about Daniel's setup with this foreign conquering king. It says, "Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, his chief of staff, to bring to the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal family and other noble families who had been brought to Babylon as captives. Select only strong, healthy, and good-looking young men," he said. "Make sure they're well-versed in every branch of learning, are gifted with knowledge and good judgment, and are suited to serve in the royal palace. Train these young men in the language and literature of Babylon." The king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from his own kitchens. They were to be trained for 3 years, and then they would enter the royal service. And so Daniel was one of these guys that was selected for like the best internship ever, okay? If you were going to be a captive in Babylon, which wasn't ideal for anyone, but if you had to be there, that this was like the best possible scenario for Daniel, that he would be recruited into the king's service, that he would be trained in the ways of government and of Babylonian thinking, and then offered not just food like anybody else, but the kind of food that came from the king's table. So the choice, this was the best meal plan ever. Some of you that are in college were like, my meal plan was not this. It was not suitable for a king, but this was. And so he was chosen to serve this king. So the best possible scenario for Daniel. But you have to still imagine, he's still in a foreign land, serving an evil enemy king. There's so much that we can take from this as well. We recognize that we are not citizens of this world, but that we are citizens of a heavenly kingdom. And so while we are here in our jobs here on earth, we're very much like Daniel. We are in a foreign land, and there is a king of this world who is not in line with King Jesus. Satan is the current ruler of this world, and he is an evil enemy king. And so we very much see ourselves in Daniel's position. Now let's jump to chapter 6, and we're going to jump ahead in Daniel's story a little bit. So after the Babylonians and King Nebuchadnezzar conquer Israel and Judah, there's another country, as was very common in this day, another country that comes in and conquers Babylon. So the bigger dog, right, always comes and eats the smaller dog. And this is a perpetual cycle in the Old Testament. And a new king, Darius, the king of the Medes and the Persians, is now on the throne. Daniel's still working in the royal court, and we see that his position gets elevated again. Chapter 6, verse 1, it says this: "Darius the Mede decided to divide the kingdom into 120 provinces, and he appointed a high officer to rule over each province. The king also chose Daniel and 2 others as administrators to supervise the high officers and protect the king's interests. Daniel soon proved himself more capable than all the other administrators and high officers. Because of Daniel's great ability, the king made plans to place him over the entire empire." And so this guy, he is excelling in his place of work, right? So the king appoints 121 governors of these 120 provinces, and then chooses 3 to serve over those 120. And so maybe they each get 40 governors to lead and to serve. You see, like, whatever branch of work you may work in, you kind of see this division as well. And of those 3, Daniel proved himself to be so able, so thoughtful, that the king's like, all right, man, this guy is killing it. I think I'm going to put him second in command to me. Like king and then Daniel. He's crushing it. In verse 4, it says, then the other administrators and high officers began searching for some fault in the way Daniel was handling government affairs. But they couldn't find anything to criticize or condemn. He was faithful, always responsible, and completely trustworthy. Man, some of you that have employees or work on a team, wouldn't that be awesome if you got your annual review or you gave annual review and all your team could be described that way? You're faithful. You're constantly responsible. You are completely trustworthy, right? These are great descriptions of Daniel. And so verse 5, so they concluded our only chance of finding grounds for accusing Daniel will be in connection with the rules of his religion. And so Daniel, he works with integrity for the benefit of this foreign conquering king. All right, so I don't know what your boss is like at work, but I'm guessing he's not as vicious as Darius was. I'm sure he or she annoys you. I'm sure you go, I can't believe you think this is important right now. Whatever the case is, or maybe you're a boss and you're thinking, man, I don't want to be like Darius either. And so Daniel chooses a life of integrity even in a place where he doesn't want to be. Daniel chooses a life of responsibility and being completely trustworthy, even in enemy territory. And this is a good encouragement for us as well, as we think about the fact that work is hard, and that means sometimes the people that we work with are hard to work with. We too can make the choice to be like Daniel and work with integrity for God by demonstrating ourselves faithful, responsible, and trustworthy. So these other administrators, they're out to get Daniel. They're going to try to find a way to get him in trouble. Verse 6, so the administrators and high officers went to the king, and they said, long live King Darius. We're all in agreement, we administrators, officials, high officers, advisors, and governors, that the king should make a law that will be strictly enforced. Give orders that for the next 30 days, any person who prays to anyone, divine or human, except to you, your majesty, will be thrown into the den of lions. And now, your majesty, issue and sign this law so that it cannot be changed, an official law of the Medes and Persians that cannot be revoked. And just like you, if you're the king and you had all of your top advisors come and say, you are amazing, we hope that you're in charge of us forever. Oh man, we want everyone to celebrate your goodness. It should be boss's day every day for the next 30 days. And no one else can say they have a greater boss than you. We want you to be lifted high. Of course, King Darius signs that law into place. Verse 10. But when Daniel learned that the law had been signed, he went home and knelt down, as usual, in his upstairs room, with its windows open toward Jerusalem. He prayed 3 times a day, just as he had always done, giving thanks to his God. Then the officials went together to Daniel's house and found him praying and asking for God's help. So they went straight to the king and reminded him about his law. Here's something really interesting. If you don't know this story, and maybe you heard this story growing up, Daniel gets thrown in the lion's den, spoiler alert. And often, we think that that's the most important part of the story. And I don't think that's the most important part of the story. That's the story that makes really great kids' flannel graph boards. It makes for a really dramatic story, makes for a really interesting story. But the win for Daniel isn't that God eventually rescues him out of the lion's den. Spoiler alert, we'll read about that in a second. I think Daniel's won right here. In this moment, when he knows that people are out to get him, there's a law that's been put in place that essentially threatens who he is going to work for, who is going to have the primary say in who he is. He's the best worker in the kingdom. And no doubt it's because, as the book records, that he has the usual practice of praying and seeking God's strength and help. I'm sure his prayers were not easy, where he's like, God, thank you for this day and for everything that's fantastic. I love it here in Babylon, and I never want to go back home. I'm guessing his prayers were heartfelt and poured out, saying, Lord, I don't want to be here. I don't like anything about this place. I know this is not the place that you would have for me and my people, but while I am here, would you give me the strength to serve this king well? Would you give me the strength to honor him for his position? Would you give me the strength to demonstrate your greatness in my position, in my life? Because Daniel had the usual practice, and this law that I'm sure he knew was just an attempt to get him run out of town did not dissuade him. He still put God first. Daniel wins right at this point. Doesn't matter what happens next, because he's made the choice that no matter what else is happening around him, no matter what the consequences of this decision, I want God to call the shots. He lives a life of full integrity. It shows up in the workplace, but it starts in this private place with God. Daniel wins because he chooses to do what's right, even though it costs him. When we don't do the right thing, when we don't put God first, it's often because we expect a payout at the end. God, I'll follow you. God, I'll honor you. God, I'll do this if I get the promotion, if I get the raise, if my boss gets fired, if I don't have to be on this team anymore, if I get this grade, if I get on this team. God, I'll follow you if the result is beneficial to me. But Daniel made the choice to follow and honor God above all other things, even though he knew that the result was consequential to himself. Daniel didn't know at this point that God was going to rescue him from the lion's den. He just knew he was going in the lion's den. Integrity proves itself only when it costs us. Integrity proves itself not in a faith that says, I'm going to do it and I'm going to trust that I'm going to get rewarded for it. No, I'm going to do it even if it costs me, because it's the right thing to do and because God comes first. We put God first because God brings meaning to everything else, not because God brings reward to everything. All of those other things achieved apart from God are empty and meaningless. You can choose to avoid some of the cost and avoid some of the consequences. Sometimes it means that your career path is slower or it looks different than you intended. But if you advance and choose to advance yourself at the neglect of God being the one that's directing you and calling the shots, you'll find that where you end up has less meaning than where you were. because God's not involved in it and he brings meaning to all things. We also see that Daniel isn't defiant in this. He's confident because he opens the windows, right? Like, he's like, man, it's okay if people see me do this. He's confident, but he's not defiant. We don't hear stories of Daniel being like, no, I'm going to put big Torah scrolls on my desk for all people to see that I follow God. I'm putting a flag of Israel on my desk to let people know, no, I stand for God. He didn't wear a Make Jerusalem Great Again shirt to work to try to prove his allegiance to God, right? He chose in the quietness of the secret place with God as his strength to live a life of integrity, even in foreign land. Even with an enemy king. He shows up first with God in prayer, asking for help and strength. And then he shows up at work to do his best for a king who's trying to steal worship from his God. Daniel wins in this moment. The story could stop here, but it wouldn't be as fantastic and dramatic as we remember it being. So let's go on. Verse 13. Says, then they told the king, that man Daniel, one of the captives from Judah, is ignoring you and your law. He still prays to his God 3 times a day. Hearing this, the king was deeply troubled, and he tried to think of a way to save Daniel. It's his top dude. He wants him around. He spent the rest of the day looking for a way to get Daniel out of this predicament. In the evening, the men went together to the king and said, Your Majesty, you know that according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, no law that the king signs can be changed. So at last, the king gave orders for Daniel to be arrested and thrown into the den of lions. The king said to him, May your God, whom you serve so faithfully, rescue you. Here's the beauty of Daniel from the secret place of life with God. Who's praying now? The king. This life of quiet integrity and testimony has the king, compelled by the law that he's served, say a prayer for Daniel as he throws him in the lion's den. I hope your God saves you. It may not be much, but it's probably better than his previous prayers and who he was previously praying to. Verse 17, a stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. The king sealed the stone with his own royal seal and the seal of his nobles so that no one could rescue Daniel. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night fasting. He refused his usual entertainment and couldn't sleep at all that night. He's tore up about what's going on with his dude. Very early the next morning, the king got up and hurried out to the lion's den. When he got there, he called out in anguish, Daniel, servant of the living God. What's this confession that the king has now? Was your God, whom you serve so faithfully, able to rescue you from the lions? Daniel answered, Long live the king. My God sent his angel to shut the lion's mouth so that they would not hurt me, for I have been found innocent in his sight, and I have not wronged you, your majesty. Here's the beautiful reality. Daniel won in the quiet, secret place with God. Darius won when God showed up and rescued Daniel. It wasn't for Daniel's benefit. I mean, the fact that God saved him is a beautiful thing. It's a fantastic story, but it doesn't demonstrate any greater level of faith than when he went to the quiet place with God and said, Lord, no matter what in this difficult situation, I want to honor you and follow you, make me strong enough. It was for Darius's benefit that God rescued Daniel. We see him praying and proclaiming, and now he's totally overjoyed. And check out what happens. Not because Daniel was this flamboyant follower of God, but because in the secret place, he asked God for strength to live in enemy-occupied territory. It says this, the king was overjoyed and ordered that Daniel be lifted from the den. Not a scratch was found on him, for he had trusted in his God. Then the king gave orders to arrest the men who had maliciously accused Daniel. He had them thrown into the lion's den along with their wives and children. The lions leapt on them and tore them apart before they even hit the floor of the den. All right, some of you are like, okay, so in the quiet place, my boss will get what he deserves. No. Let's see what keeps happening here. Verse 25. Then King Darius sent this message. King Darius sent this message to the people of every race and nation and language throughout the world. Peace and prosperity to you. I decree that everyone throughout my kingdom should tremble with fear before the God of Daniel. He just signed a law 30 days before that everyone should bow and worship him. And now he's sending out a decree to all people throughout the entire kingdom. For he is the living God, and he will endure forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed, and his rule will never end. He rescues and saves his people. He performs miraculous signs and wonders in the heavens and on earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian, who is the next king who came on. Isn't that beautiful? Daniel won in the quiet place, but the king and a nation wins in Daniel's rescue. God rescued Daniel so the entire kingdom of Persia would hear about him. Not from Daniel, but from their own king. And besides our enemies, here's the reality. Almost everyone wins when we put God first. This is the crazy upside down truth of God's kingdom. When we think of self and others and God, and we get so confused because we think, if I put myself at the bottom of that list, am I really going to be fulfilled? Am I just going to be stuck in a job that I hate for the rest of my life? And the reality is this: when God is first and we let him call the shots, then we're no longer influenced, and our identity isn't shaped by the perception and thoughts of others. And he pours out his goodness to us in ways that we experience meaning in all of our life, even in really difficult places. But it feels so upside down because we have the least priority. But when we put God first, others second, and self last, we find the greatest fulfillment, contentment, and effectiveness in our lives and jobs when we put them in the right order. And so as time's coming to an end, I want to jump to this moment. Worship team, if you'll come up. Really, really amazing story from Daniel's life. And I want us to have a moment of self-examination. Okay, right now, just before the Lord, in your place of work or in the place you're giving primary energy outside of your family, or maybe it's in your family if you're a stay-at-home parent. Who's calling the shots? Even if it feels like a really difficult place. Even if it feels like a really combative boss. Or is a combative boss, not just feels that way. Are you asking God for strength to show up in that place of work? To show up at that class, to show up on that team and say, Lord, would you give me the strength to be faithful, responsible, and trustworthy, to live a quiet life that honors you no matter what the cost, to live a life of integrity that I allow you to lead when I'm worshiping, when I'm reading the Bible, but also when I punch that time clock, when I start that project, when I show up for work. Just ask the Lord. Go ahead and have a moment of self-examination. Who's calling the shots when it comes to your work? Who's in charge in the areas of your primary responsibility? Maybe today you're realizing, you know what, the reason I'm not fulfilled is because I'm just trying to satisfy my own appetites, and I just find myself hungry for more. That promotion wasn't enough, that raise wasn't enough, that time off wasn't enough, that recognition wasn't enough. Or maybe you find yourself resentful towards others, secretly, pridefully angry, wondering why other people don't care as much as you do or put in as much work as you do. That's what happens when others are the ones calling the shots in our life. But when God calls the shots, we're able to see clearly who we are and what He's calling us to do. And maybe today, if you find that that order is out of order, that others or self have made it to the top of the list and overtaken God's spot, would you just ask right now, say, Lord, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I want you to be first in my job. I want you to be first at school. I want you to be first in my family. Give me the strength to quietly show up with you so that I can show up every day in the areas of my responsibility. Lord, we trust in you. Spend some time with the Lord and then join us in worship.